All right, so we'll go ahead and start. My name is James Grant. I'm the Customer Success Manager here at iMeasureU. For those of you who don't know what iMeasureU is, we are a lower limb load monitoring solution for return to play and athlete tracking. So just a few bits of housekeeping before I hand it over to Daniel. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you should have a Q&A link on the bottom of your Zoom window. So type in your questions, and at the end we'll have a question and answer portion, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. The recording will be sent to you afterwards, so if you have to leave early for any reason, we will be sending out the link after the recording's been processed. If you want to be notified of any future webinars, make sure you sign up for our newsletter. This is webinar number 2 in our series. And at the end, if we don't get to your questions, you'll be redirected to our Get in Touch page on our website. So if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to ask us a question there, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So let me introduce Dr. Daniel Greenwood. Daniel is the Director of Human Performance Center at the University of Memphis. The HPC provides applied sports science solutions to practical questions posed by coaching, strength, and athletic training staff. He's originally from Australia, and he's held applied sports science roles in elite sport for over 15 years, most recently at the Australian Institute of Sport. And he has a passion for using science, data, and understanding to improve athlete performance and coaching pedagogy. He has a background in biomechanics and a specialization in skill acquisition. Daniel's ecological approach is evident within his research. He's constantly searching for practical outcomes to applied questions. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Daniel and let him take it away.
Cheers, James. Cheers, Blake. Hi, everybody. Thanks for giving up your time to listen in here today. Yeah, really excited just to present and share, I guess, what we're doing at the University of Memphis. We've brought in a lot of, I guess, the approach that we would use in Australia around applied sports science, and just want to show how we're using that across an entire program within a Division I college setup. I think it's important to note before we go too far that this is not just my work that I'm sharing today. Within the Human Performance Center and within the School of Health Studies at the University of Memphis, we've got these very, very bright, very, very talented and very, very good looking people who also work with me within their given disciplines. And my role as the director really is to bring Tigers Athletics and the School of Health Studies together to complete applied sports science projects for both of our benefits. So specifically, my challenge is about finding out what challenges the coaches are having, bringing those problems back, and then using discipline-specific experts to answer those questions. I think of important note, so this is our family, this is our Human Performance Center family. I think it's important to note the contributions of these three young superstars, Taylor, Megan, and Adriana. Their work as graduate students has all been using the IMU in one way or another. And so their work is littered throughout here, both in terms of their help getting data, their help analyzing things, and their help basically running projects by themselves. So specific shout out to those three legends and the work that they've done to bring today to life. So let's get cracking. Definitely the quietest group I've ever presented to, so this is going to be an interesting experience and I look forward to it. So I guess I wanted to start by saying that the way we operate at the Human Performance Center is around working with coaches to understand their problems and challenges and then designing projects around that. And so I think it's important to point out that I guess we're not slaves to the iMeasureU tool or any tool within our toolbox, but instead our job is to take the applied questions, then come up with a project or a scientific way of measuring that. So I don't want you to think of me and the people that I work with as these zombies that walk around with these sensors trying to find things to plug them onto or athletes to stick them onto to get data. Instead, the model is actually flipped in that our starting process is with the coaches, talking to them about their needs, what they're trying to achieve, and then using, where appropriate, the sensors to answer those applied questions. So really today's presentation is sort of pretty much split into two. You've got the first half, which is going to be about talking about how we develop those relationships with coaches, what our sports science model looks like at the University of Memphis, at the Human Performance Center, and then how, I guess, we build our projects out. And then the second half is going to be a series of projects that we've done to answer the applied questions that the coaches are posing towards us. So, I mean, I really like this sort of concept. So in the background is a bunch of coaches that I've been privileged enough to work with throughout my career. And I think it's important that as scientists, we appreciate the knowledge that coaches can bring to our scientific approach, that not understanding that their experiential knowledge is really something that can contribute and really, I guess, build into the work that we're doing. It would be naive to think that we have all the answers and that we have all of the, I guess, the solutions to all the problems, and instead taking that experiential knowledge that they have, merging it with our empirical scientific knowledge, and then creating, creating answers to applied questions. From a sports scientist point of view, I think it's important that we are making athletes better in the areas that coaches define as important, or trainers or strength coaches. I know certainly as a young sports scientist, my sort of goal was to, I guess, take my brain out and share everything I knew with coaches and make sure that they knew what I knew. Whereas in matter of fact, it's actually better to understand, what their interest is at any given moment, and then fill in that blank at one at a time, rather than I guess, working across your agenda, working across their agenda instead. So, project-based approach. So this is something that was shared with me originally at the Australian Institute of Sport when I was there, working with Australia's Olympic development athletes. And I think it's a pretty simple way of using applied sports science in a multi-sport setting. So everything that we do, whether it big or small, from a 1 hour intervention with an athlete all the way through to a season-long, periodization work with our football program, is all couched within projects. So those projects, just like scientific research would, they have a pre-test, a post-test, an intervention, and an opportunity to stop and reflect on what we're doing. Each of those projects brings in different experts based on the work we're doing, and we're very, very closely engaged with the coaches or the athletic trainers or the strength coaches who want the answers to the question. It's very important that they are as much a part of the project as we are. So, I mean, we use phrases like coach originated, and I think that's really important, that there's nothing worse than being given a report by a scientist that you're not that interested in or you're not going to action upon. And so if the coaches aren't invested in the outcomes from the outset, then they're probably not going to change their behavior as a result of it. All of our work has some sort of performance aspect that we're measuring, or health aspect, or whatever it is that's important. And I think even our big projects, like our year-long projects, have multiple projects built within them to give us a chance to stop, reflect, and reset. There's nothing worse than collecting data over a long period of time, or measuring stuff to get a database, or we're just going to explore this. Even if we're just exploring things, we're still couching that within a defined time window so that we have an opportunity to stop and have a better conversation with our coaches and our athletes about what's going on. And we used to use the phrase embedded with sports. And as an applied sports scientist, we quickly found that embedded actually became pretty close to entangled, where you sort of got stuck, I guess, sort of almost too close so that you couldn't see the forest for the trees. So the way our project-based approach allows us to have that slightly removed relationship, where we're still invested in the athletes, we're still invested in the coaches, we're still doing what's needed to be done, but at the outset, we've got a very clearly defined agreement, I guess, between the coach and myself around what it is that we're going to do, so that we don't have excuses for missed data. We don't have excuses for, athletes not participating. It's almost something that we agree upon. Daniel Plews, who was my colleague in Singapore and he's a awesome man now based in New Zealand. He's really summarized some of this stuff nicely, which was when he said, your job as a sports scientist is to understand what matters and then measure what matters the most. And I think that's a really nice summary of sports science. With, especially these days, we can measure whatever we want, really. There's no limit to the amount of things we can measure, and our challenge really is to measure as few things as possible to give as much practical output as we can. And yeah, hopefully we'll share that as we go through. So when I first started at the University of Memphis, the biggest challenge is always finding the coaches and trainers' biggest challenge. Now I say that because if we're on a spectrum where we've got sort of in an Australian terminology, knobhead scientist who sort of sits in his lab on one end, and then at the other end, you've got the very, very engaged, embedded scientist who works closely with the coach. You're on this spectrum. And that spectrum is built on trust and built on the relationship between you and the coach, and built on an understanding that you're both there to make athletes better. I think when if you think about your communication in general or your communication with people, depending on where you are on this spectrum of trust and the relationship you have, you get different answers to the same question. So if I ask somebody I don't know, how are you? I'll get, yeah, good. How was training today? Yeah, it was good. Great. If I ask my wife or a really good friend, how was your day? I'll get a very different contextual answer, and I'll get a lot more detail around what's going on. My day was good because of this, it was bad because of this, and these are things that are really bothering me. And the same thing goes for when we ask coaches, what are you struggling with? What are your biggest challenges? If you don't know them that well and you don't really have a strong relationship with one another, they'll give you generic answers like, oh, we want them to be fitter, we want less injuries, we want the boys to work harder, we want the girls to what does our softball coach want? We want our girls to think more about their approach to training or their weightlifting program. So you get very, very generic answers when you have very, very limited relationships with coaches. And as you add things like time, commitment, understanding, and just being there and showing that, I love the quote, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And until they understand that you're there for the right reasons, and once they do that, you can then move up that spectrum and get far more nuanced answers as to what are you working on, what are you really struggling with, and what challenges are you actually having. So a lot of our time, especially at the outset, was just about building relationships, not trying to do projects as such, but really just find out what the true challenges of coaches were. And I love the quote from Vern Gambetta. He shared this with me at the Sports Biometrics Conference last year. And he used the phrase high touch, not high tech approach to sports science. And I think that's a really nice way to summarize what applied sports science should look like, where while we're using high tech equipment, that's not what's defining our work. It's actually that high touch bit, that relationship building, which actually defines the projects which define your success. So to sports scientists that say, he doesn't really like sports science, this coach really isn't buying in, he isn't really, getting on board with the program, I always ask the question, well, how well do you know them? Do you understand their philosophy? Do you know their team goals? Do you truly know the area that they're focused on and that they want help in? When we're trying to change coach behavior, they wouldn't do something if they didn't think it worked in some way. So we have to understand them, their background, and I guess their philosophies if we want to make a change. With always a reminder that scientists don't usually lose a job when their team underperforms, but coaches' jobs, their livelihoods of their families are often, can be on a knife edge. And so the decisions that they make to introduce sports science, to give you access to their athletes, to take time away from their coaching, their program, their strength coach, you need to have built the trust and have the justification for what you're doing. I mean, the two pictures in the background are neat little examples of how you need to understand coaches' backgrounds before you can actually do research. And so on the left is one of our Australian gymnastics athletes. So I was privileged enough to work with the Australian men's vault team, and we're doing a lot of work on run-ups, and that was great for me because my PhD was actually in run-ups. And so I was just chomping at the bit. Vlad, who's the head coach, and I was just like, yes, we're going to do this and this and this. We're going to measure their run-ups. We're going to understand the velocity. And he was like, we'd been going for a couple of weeks, and I knew that he wasn't really that into it. And I was like, what is going on? Like, this is my PhD. I know everything about this. Come on. And it turned out that, yes, he loved the velocity data and he loved the takeoff data, but it turns out he wasn't that interested in the run-up data, which is what I was continually selling because that's what my PhD was in. And I was like, and one day after training, we just sat down. I was like, come on, Vlad, fess up. What's going on really here? And it's like, I like the run-up stuff and all, obviously the velocity stuff's important, but the steering stuff you're talking about, I don't really get it. See, when I was an athlete, I was pretty blind, so I used to just work it out by running into the vault. I was like, what? Yeah, I just used to run into the vault sometimes by accident, and I just learned not to run into the vault. So it turns out he doesn't actually see very well. So the idea of me teaching him on the importance of visual regulation never really got us anywhere. And so understanding that background, that philosophy, then helped me shift all of our work that we were doing to stuff that actually mattered to him. So where did we start at the University of Memphis? Well, once we started building these relationships, we actually did a series of coach interviews across the entire university. So every coach and assistant, and hopefully most assistant coaches, we participated in an interview with myself that lasted between around 55 and the longest one was about 155 minutes, just talking about their approach to athletes, their coaching philosophy, their beliefs on sports science, and how they want to use sports science. And I think these quotes here really quite neatly sum up, I guess, the way that coaches feel about science, that they want to be part of the program. They don't want to be left on the side. They don't want you to come in, do science and disappear. They want to share ideas, but sometimes they're a little bit nervous about, how to do that. So I guess with all the things we do, tailoring our message and tailoring the way we treat our data is really important to the level that the coaches are at, and the level that their athletes are at. You wouldn't, teach algebra to a 3-year-old, just as you wouldn't bring in some of your really high-tech and understanding and analysis of data to a coach that's never seen it before. And you'd hope that the coaches do the same with you. Like the coaches don't talk to me, the football coaches don't talk to me about route running and that sort of thing, because I'm still trying to learn which positions are which in football. So them speaking in that language, they dumb it down for me just as I change my tone for them. So our research, our interviews sort of brought out these, you can see that pie chart at the top, these were the themes that they kept sort of coming back to as the areas that they wanted working on. And as a result, we then built these 5 pillars of sports science that we do at the University of Memphis. So you can see the athlete preparation, which is our athlete onboarding and screening processes, skill improvement, which essentially becomes biomechanics and skill acquisition, our sports nutrition program, our athletic capacity, which is really about physical development and our workload and recovery analysis. And then our athletic rehabilitation, which is really about helping our athletic trainers to help our athletes to return to play either quicker or stronger or more confident. And so today's process, I'm going to talk through how we've used iMeasure sensors in athlete preparation, skill improvement, athletic capacity, and rehabilitation settings. As you can imagine, there's not a huge need for inertial sensors on the lower limbs in sports nutrition, but who knows? I'm sure somebody can find a place for them. Maybe knife chopping skills. Let's go. Anyway, so I guess why did we apply the IMUs for these projects? I mean, the strengths and limitations of the IMUs are pretty clear once you start using them. I mean, they're really easy to use, they're easy to turn on, and they're easy to operate. And you can have a full battery of them running pretty quickly. That symmetry data, that right-left stuff is always really fascinating. Although one of the limitations of it is I'm still not convinced that we really know how much asymmetry is good and how much is bad. And some of the metrics that we use, we don't really have huge cohorts of normalized data, especially within our specialized populations. We don't necessarily know what a lower limb loading and the amount of impact should be for a female volleyballer who's a freshman, for example. So we're making some assumptions with what we're doing, but I guess the fact that we can use these sensors in training and in competition, we're not dragging athletes out of training to do testing. We're simply measuring their behavior in I guess ecologically valid settings. And that data is really simply downloaded and presented and interpreted at its basic level. Steps and steps intensity is a really easy thing for practitioners and scientists to understand. So I guess we're aware of these strengths and limitations. And I guess as you'll see through these projects, you can see how some of them work. So these are the 4 areas that I'm going to share with you that we've used the IMUs, and we're going to start off with our athletic rehabilitation, because I think that one-on-one setting where you're working with individual athletes, especially around lower limb injuries, where you're dealing with asymmetries and you're dealing with recovery from injury, I just think that the tracking of data is just vital to, I guess, to add clarity to what skilled athletic trainers are already doing. So each of our projects, I mean, this is a quote from Larry Reynolds, who is, an astonishingly wonderful athletic trainer that we have here at the University of Memphis. He works with the football program mainly, and he does a lot of the individual rehab. And he had this really nice quote about how it's not my job to provide answers for him. it's not his job to provide, instructions for me. It's about working together and really, really combining my knowledge in terms of, how we can measure things and how we can understand things to his sort of already applied knowledge that he has. He's asking very specific questions because we've got a good relationship, and you'll see that in the following settings. So with all of our projects I'm going to talk through, we've got this blue box here, which really is the person that's asking for the program. It's their words as to what they want. And then you'll see some graphs, and then you'll see, I guess, the scientific version of that up in the top in that gray box. So our first project was using the IMUs for ACL rehab. So you had one of our athletes that was coming back from injury, and you can see on the left graph, you've got, sort of early on in the program, and then on the right, you've got later in the program. And I guess what we're looking at is that difference between right and left impact load over a session. And I think what was interesting about using the IMUs in this case, so what Larry and I would do is after every session, we'd download our data, and then we'd sit and we'd look through both the drills, we'd look at it compared to the previous days. And it was really about making sure that he got out of the day what he thought he got out of the day. And so really simple things like sometimes we would look at a drill and you'd see a really marked difference in our right-left loading just for that drill. And so we're able to then take them for the next day. We would either change the drill slightly or change the feedback that we were giving the athletes in that drill to make sure we got the impacts that we thought we were getting. We had a really interesting day one day where we did the same day we did before, and the day before we had a really sort of normal asymmetry for an ACL athlete, and the second day we had a really balanced loading rate. And all we did differently was give our athlete a football to do his drills with. And that process of just simply holding a football all of a sudden took his mind off this knee and took his mind off all his problems, and it reminded him that he's a footballer and he's allowed to load that leg. So I guess collecting that data really just brings some of these things to life that you can't really see with your eyes, I guess. The other space was we put the sensors on early one day just because I turned up early, and that's the way it is. And we saw this really big difference in loading even before the session started. And what we realized is that our athlete was just walking around, and he still wasn't able to load, he still wasn't loading that leg properly just in walking around. And so until we got him, I guess, thinking about, putting that foot down at all times, we were never really going to get the long-term changes that we wanted. And so a lot of our summaries with our lower limb injuries are, I need you to walk with purpose, and I need you to stick your foot in the ground hard at our higher intensities. We see a relative balance sort of within our medium intensities, but we see a big imbalance in our low and high intensity, sort of favoring that healthy leg, so to speak. And so just being able to give the athletes the data and say, look, this is what's happening. I'm challenging you to fix it, as opposed to telling them how to do it. Our goal really is to show, this is what's happening. I want you to start sticking your foot in the ground at higher impacts, see how it feels. And I want you to start walking with purpose. So this was another program working with an athlete who had a foot injury. And the practical challenge that our athletic trainer had was that the coaches wanted this athlete back now. They needed him for this week of football, and the athletic trainer knew that he wasn't ready. And so on the left, we've got our GPS data. So we've got our player load and our player load per minute across those training weeks. And then you've got his maximum velocity those weeks. So we use that GPS data in association. You can see the impact load data on the right, where that data is from week 9, 10, and 11. And so you can see just how he was not ready in week 9 to get on with it. Week 10, he was close, but definitely still not loading his limbs evenly. And then that week 11, just as his velocity is increasing and maximum velocity is increasing as well, you can see that lower limb impact is much more even. And I think the important thing here was that without that data, the only thing he had to, I guess, argue his case with was, I know he's not ready. And there's only so long that you can use that as a coping as a justification for what you're doing. I know that he's not ready. Well, how not ready? Well, he's just not quite ready. But we've now got this data which says, look, here it is, he's not ready. And it just stops the conversation there, and it stops the heated nature of the conversation between coaches and support staff. And I think it just gives clarity to everybody as to what's going on. And it also allows you to build a much more, I guess, clear process as to how you're going to how far away you are. Another sort of standard sort of athlete question. So this was another one of a different athlete coming back from ACL rehab, and we just wanted to make, this was an athlete who was one of those guys that just want to do stuff all the time. And so you can see through that total impact load data on Tuesday the 29th, the athletic trainer just sort of left him to his own devices after he'd done his first hour. He was then just allowed to watch training, and that's sort of what he'd do every day. He would do an hour with him, and then he'd just watch training for the rest of the day. And it turns out that second day, unbeknownst to the athletic trainer, he disappeared off behind and started doing his own workouts. And so thankfully we actually had the sensors on to realize just how much work he'd done when we weren't watching, so we could actually have a conversation about why he needed to pare it back and why we needed to make sure that we aren't overdoing it. And you can see that correction there the following week where we've got much more consistent and ramped loads there. So again, simple things, these simple questions that I just want to make sure we're not overdoing it are answered really clearly with that lower limb data. So as we move into our athletic capacity stage, we're now talking about working with coaches to answer questions around, mostly it's around training versus game loading. And I guess you're starting to delve into that world of understanding training load. And so in this case, we're simply using steps, total steps, and intensity of steps to compare training and matches and just see what was there. And I mean, the practical question that, so this was with our tennis team was, you can see, what are our girls' matches like? I figure we train, right? And I guess it's just what we've always done, but I don't really have any data to show that. And you can see there on the right, sort of the differences that we saw between training and competition. So per minute, our steps in training were higher than in competition. Our total steps in training were higher. Our steps per minute, our lower limb workload, and our low intensity steps were all lower in training than they were in competition, with our medium intensity steps higher. So let's just, instead of me rattling through that, let's just pare that back. What was happening in competition was our performance had more high and more low intensity steps and less medium intensity steps. And we also had less total steps. And so what it was showing was that in competition, if you think about a tennis match, it's very on or off. Whereas our training had a lot more of these sort of, 1-2 minute hitting drills, a lot more medium intensity movements, a lot more sort of gentle shuffling. And so as a result, what we did in our training setting was we tried to imitate a bit more of that hard on or off behavior and get away from some of that, longer rally type of work in training to focus more on what our competition actually looked like. Similar thing so this is our women's soccer program. So this is a coach from, this is our athletic trainer and our strength coach talking through this. And so, that simple question, are our girls training hard enough? And the answer was yes, our girls are training hard enough. If you look at the intensity distribution on the right, you can see we're actually doing more high intensity work per minute in training than we were in competition, which I guess, makes sense. But if we look at the intensity distribution per minute, you can see we're actually doing a lot more low intensity steps in competition than we were in training. If you think about a soccer match, especially the way with the tactics that the University of Memphis women's team uses, they are constantly on the move. They're always shuffling. They're just low intensity steps, just moving to the left, moving to the right, working in formation, constantly moving. And our training wasn't representing that, because our training had a lot of stop, start, stand at the cone, get feedback, move on. So just a simple addition we added to our training was, instead of standing at a cone, we then had a side cone that you had to shuffle around while you're waiting. Instead of, getting feedback, we shortened our feedback times to enable our athletes to continue moving a lot more, and just constantly encourage that you know what, if we're at training, we're going to be moving, because that's exactly what we expect in the game. We want our girls constantly moving and constantly shuffling. And so you can see just that low intensity steps really are walking or very, very slow jogging. As soon as we get to medium intensity, that's our sort of side to side, I guess, slight agility work. So we're really just asking the girls to keep moving. Our men's basketball program, this was a recovery project, really. Well, not even so the challenge that the basketball trainers were having was around getting the boys to, do the details of their recovery and that sort of thing. And they were having huge impact loads for their training session, and these boys work. And a lot of the time they were just too stuffed to bother with their recovery. So we introduced a simple thing of, if your impact load is over X, then you're expected to do your full recovery. So it wasn't just using that data as a fail-safe to encourage our athletes to do, the little details that we ask of them. As we move into athlete preparation phase, this is some of the work we did with our women's basketball program around athlete screening. And we've developed a really nice screening process, which, we do our hamstring quad strength, we do our sleep analysis, our body comp, and we do a bunch of, hopping, landing, jumping tasks in the lab. But the gap that was always missing was that, well, what happens on court? This is our lab movements, but we don't have any data of their sort of on-court baselines. And so especially when you're tracking return to play, we didn't have any of this sort of on-court baseline in order to, really aim for something to move back to. And so all of the girls, so with this process, as part of our screening now, we also collect a week's worth of data of the girls on court, and found some really interesting things in terms of although their right-left strength might be all right, their loading on court can actually be quite different. And one of the interesting ones was our girls who are better at driving with one hand than the other are constantly loading up one leg more than the other in training, just because that's the way they're going. That's sort of almost the nature of their training, especially when they do a lot of scrimmage work in a day. So what ended up happening is that we ended up putting a larger focus on the skill development in that weaker side, to have not only a skill improvement, but also a lower limb, health workload asymmetry as well, with the idea that if we can open up this as an option for them, they're going to use that more often, and then ultimately balance out that lower limb loading more often. One of our athletes in particular, one of our very talented athletes, she understood that she was imbalanced, but I guess she didn't really understand how imbalanced she was between right and left. So we've got some of that high intensity step counts there on the left graph, and you can see just how much extra work she's doing on that right limb across a week. And I guess what we used the data to show just how imbalanced she was in terms of that right-left loading, and that she did need to take her gym work more seriously. It was something that she did, but she wasn't fully engaged in, and that was a challenge that the athletic trainer posed to us, or the strength coach, sorry, about, I know she's doing it, but I needed to buy in more. And the data was a way to open that door, to have that conversation, to say how important it is, and say how different her numbers look compared to others, and really about, a lot of this data is about facilitating conversation. It's about opening communication lines with something that's not confrontational. That data is not, it's not an opinion that's, that can get heated, or, that you might or might not believe. It's about, well, this is what's happening. What do you think about it? How can we change it? This is a really nice load monitoring project that was done by one of our grad students, Megan Briley. She just graduated. Shout out to Megan. And in this case, she was using the IMU sensors to measure load in training, and really to provide a better understanding of load when understanding, are we measuring minutes? Are we measuring distance? Or is there something better that we can do to understand what the impact of training is on our cross-country athletes? This is Max Paquette. Shout out to you, Maximus. This is his baby, really, and Megan did an excellent job, just in terms of providing a really easy way to get a better understanding of what an athlete's doing in training, and how getting that extra data can provide an extra layer of understanding about what's being asked of them in a running session. Our skill improvement as our final piece looks at, this was a nice project again that Max ran with Megan's help around running asymmetry, and he worked very, very closely with athletic trainer and athletes who had already returned from injury but still weren't fully confident in what they were doing. And I guess as with a lot of our data, our goal was not to change their technique as such, but it was to provide them with the information to show them that they are still in balance, they're still favoring that that previously uninjured side, and to give them the opportunity to get some real-time feedback to see if running more evenly, how that feels. So at no point were we telling them that they had to do this, but simply giving them the data and the live feedback to see what it feels like to run evenly. And in all 4 cases for these athletes, simply getting the data and being like, oh, okay, so I am imbalanced. Let's try to open that up. Oh, yeah, I remember what that feels like. And that's the case with a lot of elite athletes. They don't need a lot of prompting to get the right feeling. They just need to see the data and almost be set a challenge, and they'll solve that problem themselves, rather than, I don't need to tell them to put their foot down harder or push off harder or, straighten their knee or something stupid like that. Instead, it's much more about, here's your data, here's your challenge. Can you even it up? How does that feel? Does it feel good or bad? If it feels bad, chuck it out. If it feels good, let's keep doing it. And the final piece that we were doing with our IMU sensors was around one of our softball projects. So we took the sensors off the lower limbs, and we just used them as inertial sensors on the hip, pelvis, trunk, lead arm, and lead wrist to look at the biomechanics of hitting for softball. Now, these obviously aren't what IMeasure use particularly pitching it for, but they are inertial sensors. They are accurate, and you can take the data out, the individual plane data out, which is what we did here. And what we used the data for was to help the coach with their messaging to athletes, to help athletes understand what they were talking about. That sequence of hitting in softball is vital to creating velocity, and softball has now become just like golf and just like baseball, it's a power sport. It's about crushing home runs basically. And whilst the coaches can go on and on about holding back that lead arm and leading with the pelvis and trunk, until the athletes could actually see the data, they couldn't really understand exactly what was being asked of them. So again, we use that data as a platform for discussion, as a platform to understand feel, and then as a way for athletes to better understand what's going on. So, that's me. That's what the Human Performance Center is doing at the moment. And I guess I wanted to sort of summarize today's presentation by talking about how our goal was not to measure stuff at any point in time. Our goal was always had that problem at the front end of everything we did. And I think that's a really important feature of applied sports science, that when you're just measuring stuff, you sort of lead yourself down a sort of dead end in terms of trying to find answers within a haystack of data. But you also become the sensor guy, or the GPS guy or girl, or the force plate dude, where if you're solving problems, you're actually the problem solver guy. You're actually the person that's helping that athlete, you're helping that coach solve problems, which is actually something that they want. They're not as excited about measuring stuff. I know as scientists, we love it. But we've got to put ourselves in that point of view that, they're looking for applied solutions. So at all times, our role is really about solving problems and understanding what the needs are of our coaches. At the front end, I talked about the benefits of a project-based approach and how sort of couching everything as a start-stop project at the very least, it gives you some pre and post data to look at how behavior is changing, or to track how things are moving. And it gives you a stopping point at which you're able to have a formal sit down with the coach and talk about what happened and what you want to do next. If you don't have that sort of full stop, you find yourself sort of continually collecting data, and interest and stuff sort of slowly peters out over time. And so our role really is about being engaged with that coach at all times. Really importantly, that relationship building with coaches and everybody really. This whole industry is built on trust. It's built on competence, and it's built on, working with people that you believe are there for the right reasons. And so we need, as scientists, one of our major roles is about understanding what the needs of our clients, coaches or athletes are, and really building stuff around them to provide, I guess, to provide practical outcomes to problems that they're genuinely having at this point in time. And I guess then finally, I guess my idea, with sharing those variety of projects that we did was not to necessarily get too caught up on what those projects were or I guess what we were doing, but really to spark ideas and provide some sort of actionable takeaways for people to go, oh, I could try that, or maybe I hadn't thought of, pulling it apart that way, or I didn't think about, I guess, presenting the data in different ways to those different audiences. I mean, we present our data on step data to our strength coaches and a lot of our athletic trainers very differently than we would some of our on-field coaches. And even within there, you've got different levels on the spectrum of how you pull apart that data to present stuff. We try to stay away from generic reports and instead provide bespoke solutions to applied problems that coaches are having. So that's my pitch, and yeah, let's chat.
Thanks, Daniel. Really awesome presentation. We do have some really good questions, so I want to make sure we get to as many as we can. And just a reminder, if you do have a question for Daniel, you can enter it at the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. But the first one comes from Clint. He says, when do you think that asymmetries are an issue for the athlete, and when would you tell someone is back to normal and ready to play?
Great question, Clint. I mean, ideally, you'd have some healthy data on that athlete to sort of give you a guidance as to what they look like before their injury. Asymmetry is we generally pull out numbers like 4%, 5%, 3%, but I don't have any sort of justification as to why it should be 4% and not 5%. It's the way we do it usually is we add the empirical knowledge we use that data and we add it to the knowledge of the athletic trainer or the strength coach before we make any decisions. So I guess we take the decision out of our hands and out of the data's hands, and we put it on those experts who are experts in those fields, which is, does the athletic trainer say that they're ready to go? Well, if they say they're ready to go and the data says, it's close enough, well, then I'm prepared to deal with that. But at least we have that data to, I guess, back up their visual and intuitive thoughts. So I guess we're not being slaves to the data in terms of saying it has to be here, but we're using that data as a premise to add to the experiential knowledge of our trainers and our coaches to then, make the decision from there.
Daniel, do you maybe want to bring up that graph you talked about when you were speaking to the athlete not being ready in terms of asymmetry? That might be a good one for Clint to see again.
That's your guy?
Yeah, so I'll just speak to that a little bit. So Clint, in the graphs there, you're able to see the difference between the left and the right total impact load in the shaded area behind the graph. So while it's not going to give you exactly in this graph the 4 to 3% difference, it is going to show you just kind of a really quick overview that the left leg is significantly different than the right leg, and over time it is getting better here. All right, so I'll move on to the next question. So this one comes from Edwin. He says, in your experience as an athlete is recovering from an injury, do their forces as measured by iMeasureU go up, indicating more loading, or down because their muscles are able to absorb more of the impact? And then second part to that question, does that change depending on whether the measurements are done with a specific test versus over the course of play? Sorry,
can you say that again, James? So we're talking
about... I'll say the first part first, and we can separate out the second part. So in your experience as an athlete is recovering from an injury, do their forces as measured by iMeasureU go up or go down because their muscles are able to absorb more of the...
Oh, yeah, I'm with you. Well, they go up because the sensors are essentially measuring the impact on the ground traditionally. So if you think about our football players or our basketball players our tennis players, it's measuring that shock on the ground. So the harder you're sticking your foot into the ground, that sensor's getting jolted harder. So it's not necessarily, that sensor's not measuring what those muscles are doing, it's measuring what that limb's doing on the ground. So those forces are going up as they are returning, as they're sort of getting more confident, sticking that foot in the ground harder because that sensor's getting jolted harder.
And then second part to that question, does that change depending on whether you're measuring a specific test or general play, or is it pretty much across the board?
You'll see that change. It really is very task dependent. So I guess to what you're alluding to, definitely as some of our athletes sort of get better, so to speak, they'll definitely walk with slightly higher intensities as they're almost more comfortable walking. But the change in that impact really is based on the task that they're doing. It's not, I wouldn't, if you ask them to do the same task, at different stages, you'll see that impact increase as they, do it harder and do it more intensely and do it quicker and do it with more intent and confidence.
Okay, the next question is from Jeremy. He says, can you speak to the staffing requirements and solutions? We've done some basketball work with IMUs, and for one team, it's an 8+ hour job per session for a single research assistant to implement these types of technologies. How do you manage this workload across teams and staff?
Well, certainly in the early version of IMU that we used to use, it was pretty brutal in terms of download time, especially, and then I guess producing some sort of report. The new IMU sensors download the data much quicker, which has chopped down a lot of our research time. But I guess where we're trying to save time is that by being partnered with our athletic trainers and our strength coaches, they're the ones that are now putting the sensors on, and they're the ones that are then uploading the data for us, and then we're then providing the reports from there. So by being partnered with them and by answering their questions, they're the ones that are keen to, I guess, get those questions answered. So they'll either put the sensors on themselves and get them running, or they'll get one of their grad assistants to do it. So we found in the early time, a lot of our time collecting data was, you get to training an hour early because you'd put the sensors on when they're getting strapped up. And then you have to sit through 2.5 hours of a training session where, you may have coded a few things, but it didn't really matter. And so you're at 3 hours before you've even started playing with the data. So one of the ways we, I guess, shorten our time commitments was around getting other people to collect the data for us, and then us being responsible for the data analysis. I guess the other thing, I guess, around time is about understanding all of our things are a time in, importance out. So I guess if it's a really important question, then that time commitment's okay. But traditionally, the more you get to know the coaches and athletes, maybe they actually don't need data for the full squad. Maybe there's just 1 or 2 athletes that actually matter, and maybe there's actually a better question in there that we can ask more succinctly rather than collecting a whole team's data for a week of training. Maybe there's a more nuanced question we can ask first to cut down on that excessive time that's being required.
Okay, great. The next question is from Lauren. He says, I have coaches that want to do more with data and science, but don't have very well constructed questions to answer. How do you start conversations with coaches to help them better execute a needs analysis?
I think I put it on the scientist to come up with that needs analysis, and I put it on us to then take what they're telling us and put it into scientific terminology. Understand, what is it that they're trying to achieve, and it's our job to then dilute that and then present it back in, well, this is how we could measure it. And one of the simple things to do that is to change our language rather than for them to change their language. So, for example, with our football program, we now talk about work rate and workload because they're terminologies that they can understand and interpret and then change. So we got rid of the word intensity, and we got rid of some other phrases that we use because they became really grey words that didn't really have like a tangible thing that I can do with. So I guess in this context, step count, high intensity steps, they're things that I can understand and interpret and act upon. And so I guess our job as scientists is to spend time with the coach, understand what they're trying to achieve, take that out, put it through our scientific terminology, then strip it back out and then give it back to them in a way that's interpretable. And often the best way to do that is to do really small, concise, short-term projects so that you can build some momentum on that, rather than trying to, answer those big questions about, well, workload. Let's just answer a small question like, what's this athlete doing over a 2-day period? Is this change what we're thinking? So I guess it's about language, it's about understanding where they're coming from, and it's about usually, short-term projects that sort of give you a way to reconnect and discuss more.
Daniel, this is an anonymous question. How many total sensors were used with the soccer and basketball projects?
So the basketball project, we had, so we had the whole team kitted up. So we had, for women's basketball, we had 12 pairs, 13 pairs. For the soccer project, we just had a set on our main striker, our main midfielder, and our main defender. So we were just looking at 3 athletes in that case.
Okay, so this question is from Reese. He says, have you used any of these in association to recovery of bone injury, i.e. stress fractures on athletes? If so, how have you interpreted this?
I believe my colleague Max has done some of that stuff with our cross-country program. I haven't done any of that stuff myself, no. But I guess the premise is still the same in terms of you've got a tool which measures essentially workload in a more accurate way than understanding just time and distance. So I guess you'd use this as a tool just to plot, recovery process, workload process as you go through things. But I couldn't speak specifically to, I guess, how you'd use it for a bone stress injury, if that makes sense.
Okay. Probably have time for 1 or 2 more. So this one is from Zadok. He says, given the example with the athlete wearing the sensors very early, which provided insight into regular movement, what do you recommend as best time frame for wearing sensors to maximize insights? Or do you try to vary what is done while wearing the sensors to provide those insights?
Sorry, James, you just cut out on me, but...
Okay, need me to repeat it? All right, we might have lost Daniel, but that was the last question we pretty much had time for. So once the webinar is over, you'll be directed to our Get in Touch page. So if we didn't get to any of your questions, we will be able to follow up with you afterwards. And if Daniel, you can still hear me, thank you for the great presentation. I'm gonna wait a few minutes to see if he hops back on. But feel free to reach out to either Daniel or myself. And we'll be happy to discuss anything further. So thank you.
Sorry, James, you there?
Yep, still here. So we have probably 4 more minutes to answer this one last question. Mm-hmm. So this was from Zadok again. He says, given the example with the athlete wearing the sensors very early, which provided insight into regular movement, what do you recommend as a best time frame for wearing sensors to maximize insights?
I mean, I guess we got lucky with that walking example, but from that, I guess we started to use the trainer's intuition a lot more as to when they needed to wear the sensors and when they didn't. So I guess when we first started, we were like, well, we should collect every session. We should collect, let's collect them as they're walking around. And ultimately, the athletic trainers were able to give us a much better sense of, what, this session is going to be nothing. Let's not bother on a Tuesday. It's a really light session, doesn't matter. Let's focus on collecting our heavy session on Thursday and our technique session on Friday. Or, or alternatively, can I get some information on them in the gym? Let's just collect them while they're doing their weights as well. So I guess there's no one answer to that. It's really about working closely with the professionals around you and sort of almost using their intuition to guide when you're collecting data for this athlete in this case, especially in that rehab setting where things are so individualized. You know, some athletes might not be doing, might not be standing right in the gym, and they can see it and they've told the athlete and they're just not doing it. So let's use some data to help with that. So it really is a case-by-case basis, but I think the answer lies in working closely with those professionals around you so that, again, it's not on you to make all these decisions. It's on this collective group of experienced and talented and smart individuals to come up with answers. So again, you're not out there on your own making all your decisions. You're working with these people that have a lot more experience in this specific rehab space than you do to answer that question.
Okay, great. That's probably all the time we have for questions. Daniel, is there a good way for people to get in touch with you if they have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, of course. My email is daniel.greenwood@memphis.edu. You can find me through the Human Performance Center website, so that's -hpc.edu, through the School of Health Studies. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Daniel Greenwood, with zeros instead of O's. I mean, I love collaborating. I love chatting. I could talk about this stuff for days. So, my whole thing is about understanding, learning from other people as much as more than they learn from me. So yeah, always happy to chat, always happy to collaborate, and yeah, flick me a message.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. On behalf of How I Measure You, thank you so much for taking the time to do this webinar, and thank you to the attendees for your time. Thanks.
Appreciate you guys. Thank you very much.